Imagine that it is just before sunrise, more than 4,000 years ago. The first light of morning slowly spreads across the fertile banks of the River Nile, turning the water into ribbons of shimmering gold. Palm trees sway gently in the cool breeze. Fishermen quietly push their wooden boats away from the shore, and somewhere in the distance, the sound of stone tools echoes from a construction site where another magnificent temple is slowly rising from the desert. Egypt is waking up. Farmers are already preparing their fields. Priests are opening the doors of sacred temples. Merchants arrange baskets of fresh figs and dates beneath simple market stalls, and children chase each other through narrow streets built from sun-dried mud bricks. To the people who live here, this is simply another ordinary morning. Yet hidden beyond the busy towns, where the green valley meets the endless golden desert, another group of people has already begun their day's work. Their profession is unlike any other in the ancient world. They are not builders, soldiers, or scribes. They are embalmers, entrusted with one of the most extraordinary responsibilities ever given to human hands. Their task is not to care for the living, but to prepare the dead for eternity. To us, the word mummy often brings to mind adventure films, dusty tombs, mysterious curses, or museums where carefully wrapped bodies lie silently behind glass. For centuries, mummies have fascinated people around the world because they seem almost impossible. How can a human body survive for 3,000 years? Why would an entire civilization devote so much time, skill, and wealth to preserving someone after death? And perhaps most surprisingly of all, why did they become so incredibly good at it? These are questions that have puzzled explorers, historians, scientists, and curious travelers for generations. Yet for the ancient Egyptians themselves, there was very little mystery about it. Mummification was not an unusual curiosity. It was an act of love, faith, hope, and careful preparation for a journey they believed every single person would eventually make. One of the remarkable things about ancient Egypt is how completely its people embraced the idea that death was not the end of life. To them, dying was not a doorway closing forever, but another one quietly opening. Life continued, only in another form, provided the proper rituals had been followed and the body remained intact. That simple belief shaped almost everything they did. It influenced how they built their tombs, how they decorated their temples, what they wrote on their walls, what treasures they buried with their loved ones, and, of course, how they treated the human body after death. If someone hoped to live forever among the gods, then preserving the body was not merely important. It was absolutely essential. Tonight, as we drift gently through the sands of ancient Egypt, we'll follow the complete story of mummification from beginning to end. We'll meet the skilled embalmers whose knowledge was passed down through generations, discover why certain organs were carefully removed while one was always left behind, explore the remarkable chemistry that naturally preserved the human body thousands of years before modern science understood how it worked, and uncover the beautiful beliefs that inspired one of history's most famous traditions. Along the way, we'll also discover that mummies were not limited to kings. Animals became mummies, ordinary people became mummies, and eventually even the practice itself faded quietly into history as new religions and new empires transformed Egypt forever. So settle in, relax, and let the warm desert breeze carry you back to a civilization that believed eternity could begin with careful hands, strips of linen, and an extraordinary hope that life, somehow, continued beyond the horizon. To truly understand why the ancient Egyptians became the greatest embalmers in history, we first have to let go of one modern assumption. Today, many people think of death as a final destination, the closing chapter of a life that has reached its natural conclusion. Different cultures and religions hold different beliefs about what comes afterward, but for many of us, the physical body gradually loses its importance once life has ended. The Egyptians saw things very differently. To them, death was not the end of the story at all. In fact, it was only the beginning of a much longer journey, one that could last for eternity if everything was done correctly. Mummification was never intended to preserve a body simply so future generations could admire it. It existed because they believed that one day the person would need that body again. This belief was deeply woven into every part of Egyptian society. Whether someone was a farmer harvesting wheat along the Nile, a craftsman carving statues for a temple, or a mighty pharaoh ruling over millions, everyone understood that life continued beyond death. The world they entered after dying was not some distant, unfamiliar place. It was imagined as a perfected version of Egypt itself, where fields remained fertile forever, rivers never failed, and families could live peacefully under the protection of the gods. It was a comforting vision rather than a frightening one. Death was not viewed as an enemy to be defeated, but as a transition that required careful preparation, rather like setting out on a very long voyage. The Egyptians believed that every person was made up of several different parts, each playing its own role in both life and the afterlife. One of these was known as the Ka, often described as a person's life force or spiritual double. The Ka remained connected to the body even after death and still required nourishment. This is why tombs were filled with food offerings, jars of beer, baskets of bread, fruits, meats, and sometimes beautifully painted scenes showing endless feasts. The Egyptians believed that the Ka could somehow benefit from these offerings, allowing the deceased to continue existing comfortably in the next world. It may sound unusual to us, but to them it was as practical as packing enough supplies before leaving on a long journey. Another important part of the soul was the Ba, which was often depicted as a human-headed bird. Unlike the Ka, the Ba was believed to move freely between the worlds of the living and the dead. During the day, it could leave the tomb, travel wherever it wished, visit sacred places, or even watch over surviving family members. But each evening, the Ba needed to return to its body. Here lay one of the greatest reasons for mummification. If the body had decayed beyond recognition, where would the Ba return? The preserved body acted almost like a permanent home, allowing this part of the soul to recognize its earthly form and reunite with it night after night. In the Egyptian mind, preserving the body was not an act of vanity. It was an act of spiritual necessity. When the Ka and the Ba successfully reunited after death, they formed another state of existence known as the Ak. This represented the transformed, blessed spirit, one that had successfully completed its journey into eternal life and now existed among the gods. Achieving this was not automatic. It depended upon countless things going right. Proper rituals had to be performed. Correct prayers had to be spoken. Tombs needed to be protected. Offerings had to be made. And, perhaps most importantly of all, the body itself had to survive. A damaged or destroyed body threatened the entire process. To modern ears, this might sound symbolic, but to the Egyptians, it was every bit as real as ensuring a traveler had food, water, and shelter before crossing a vast desert. This is why preserving the body became such an extraordinary priority. Early Egyptians had already noticed something remarkable about their environment. Long before professional embalmers existed, people buried in shallow graves beneath the dry desert. Sand sometimes remained naturally preserved for years. The intense heat drew moisture from the body before decay could take hold, creating what we now call natural mummies. These accidental discoveries likely left a profound impression. They showed that the desert itself possessed a mysterious ability to protect the dead. Over time, as burials became more elaborate and people began placing bodies inside coffins and stone tombs instead of directly in the sand, that natural preservation disappeared. The body decayed more quickly. If they wished to preserve it once again, they would have to imitate what nature had previously done for them. In many ways, mummification was born from careful observation rather than sudden invention. Religion reinforced these ideas through one of Egypt's most beloved myths, the story of the god Osiris. According to ancient tradition, Osiris was murdered by his jealous brother Set, who cut his body into pieces and scattered them across Egypt. Osiris's devoted wife, Isis, searched tirelessly for every fragment, carefully reassembled his body, wrapped it in linen, and through powerful magic, restored him to life long enough to conceive their son, Horus. Although Osiris did not return permanently to the world of the living, he became the ruler of the underworld and the eternal king of the dead. Every Egyptian hoped to follow his example. By preserving the body, they symbolically repeated the story of Osiris himself, trusting that just as the great god had overcome death, they too might awaken to everlasting life. For the ancient Egyptians, then, mummification was never simply a technical process. It was a sacred promise. Every strip of linen wrapped around a body, every prayer whispered by a priest, every drop of fragrant oil poured upon the skin represented another step toward eternity. The embalmers were not merely preserving flesh. They believed they were protecting a person's future, safeguarding their identity, and ensuring that when the soul returned after its long journey, it would still find a familiar face waiting patiently beneath the linen wrappings. When most people picture an Egyptian mummy, they almost always imagine a pharaoh. Perhaps it is the golden mask of Tutankhamun, the grand tombs hidden beneath the Valley of the Kings, or the countless films that have convinced us mummification was a privilege reserved for rulers alone. It is an understandable assumption. After all, the kings of Egypt built pyramids that still dominate the horizon more than 4,000 years later. Their names were carved into stone temples, their faces immortalized in statues, and their tombs filled with treasures beyond imagination. Yet one of the greatest surprises waiting inside ancient Egyptian history is that mummification was never exclusively for kings. Over thousands of years, the practice gradually expanded until people from many different walks of life hoped to preserve their bodies for eternity. In a sense, mummification became one of the most enduring traditions shared across Egyptian society. In the earliest periods of Egyptian civilization, however, elaborate mummification was indeed closely associated with royalty. The pharaoh was far more than a political ruler. He was believed to be chosen by the gods and, in many respects, was considered divine himself. His health was tied to the prosperity of the kingdom. The annual flooding of the Nile, successful harvests, military victories, and the stability of Egypt were all thought to depend upon the sacred balance maintained by the king. When a pharaoh died, it was not simply the loss of a leader. It was a moment of profound religious importance. Preparing his body for eternity became a national duty, carried out with extraordinary care and accompanied by ceremonies that sometimes lasted for months. Queens received similar treatment, particularly those who held significant religious or political influence. Women such as Hatshepsut, who ruled Egypt as pharaoh in her own right, or powerful royal wives connected to great dynasties, were buried with tremendous respect. Their tombs contained beautifully crafted coffins, jewelry, perfumes, furniture, and carefully wrapped bodies prepared by the finest embalmers available. Although history often remembers Egypt through its kings, royal women also occupied essential positions within the religious life of the kingdom, and their safe passage into the afterlife was considered equally important. As Egyptian civilization grew wealthier and more organized, the opportunity to receive mummification slowly spread beyond the royal family. High-ranking officials, governors, military commanders, priests, wealthy merchants, and successful scribes increasingly sought the same eternal protection once reserved for rulers. These individuals had often spent their lives serving the state or the temples, accumulating considerable wealth along the way. They could afford skilled embalmers, beautifully painted coffins, decorated tombs, and all the rituals necessary to prepare for the next life. Walking through an ancient Egyptian cemetery during the height of the New Kingdom, you would have discovered not only kings, but also countless respected officials resting within carefully prepared tombs, each hoping for the same eternal future. Priests held an especially interesting position, since they served the gods throughout their lives. Preserving their bodies carried deep symbolic meaning. Many priests participated directly in funerary rituals for others, chanting sacred prayers and overseeing ceremonies that guided souls into the afterlife. When their own time eventually came, fellow priests performed those same rituals for them. It was a comforting cycle. Those who had spent their lives helping others prepare for eternity would themselves receive the same careful attention from the next generation. One profession that particularly benefited from Egypt's growing prosperity was that of the scribe. Unlike laborers who worked in the fields or quarries, scribes occupied respected positions within society because they could read and write, skills possessed by only a small percentage of the population. They recorded taxes, copied religious texts, managed royal accounts, and kept Egypt's vast bureaucracy functioning smoothly. Successful scribes often became wealthy enough to afford impressive burials, and many chose mummification as the final reward for a lifetime of careful service. Their beautifully decorated tombs frequently include scenes showing them peacefully riding beneath the shade of trees or supervising workers along the Nile, reminders that they hope to continue enjoying familiar pleasures forever. For ordinary farmers and craftsmen, however, elaborate mummification remained beyond reach for much of Egyptian history. The complete 70-day process required skilled specialists, expensive linen, precious oils, imported resins, carefully carved coffins, and numerous religious ceremonies. All of this came at a considerable cost. Most families simply could not afford such luxuries. Yet the desire for eternal life was not limited to the wealthy. As centuries passed, embalmers developed different levels of service to suit different budgets. Ancient Greek historian Herodotus, who visited Egypt during the 5th century BC, even described embalmers presenting grieving families with several options, each varying in quality and expense. Rather surprisingly, arranging a mummy may have involved something not entirely unlike choosing between different funeral packages today. The wealthiest families received the most elaborate treatment. Their loved ones underwent the complete process, with careful removal of internal organs, drying in natron, delicate wrapping in hundreds of meters of linen, and richly decorated coffins painted with protective gods and sacred symbols. Families with more modest means selected simpler methods. Fewer costly resins might be used. Coffins became less elaborate. The wrapping was less intricate, though still performed with dignity and care. Even those with very limited resources often tried to preserve the body as respectfully as possible, because the hope of reaching the afterlife remained universal. Children were mummified as well, a detail that quietly reminds us how deeply these beliefs shaped Egyptian life. The death of a child was no less heartbreaking 4,000 years ago than it is today. Parents hoped that their sons and daughters would continue growing, learning, and living in the next world just as adults expected to do themselves. Tiny coffins, carefully wrapped infant mummies, and small toys placed beside them have all been discovered by archaeologists, offering deeply moving glimpses into the love ancient families felt for their children. These discoveries reveal not only remarkable craftsmanship, but also timeless human emotions that bridge thousands of years. By the later centuries of Egyptian civilization, mummification had become astonishingly widespread. It was no longer the exclusive privilege of pharaohs. Wealthy merchants, respected craftsmen, temple musicians, soldiers, priests, officials, and many ordinary citizens all hoped to preserve their bodies for eternity if their families could afford it. Entire communities of embalmers flourished along the Nile, perfecting techniques that had been refined over countless generations. What had once begun as a royal tradition had gradually become a defining feature of Egyptian culture itself. And so, while the glittering tombs of kings may capture our imagination first, they tell only part of the story. Hidden beneath the desert sands are thousands upon thousands of ordinary Egyptians who shared exactly the same dream as their rulers. They wished to wake again beneath an eternal sun, walk once more beside the life-giving Nile, and reunite with the people they loved. In death, as in life, they all hoped for something beautifully simple, that their story would continue. Among all the professions in ancient Egypt, few inspired as much quiet respect as the embalmers. They were neither kings nor priests, yet they stood at the meeting point between life and death, trusted with one of the most sacred responsibilities imaginable: Every person who entered their care had already taken their final breath, but according to Egyptian belief, their greatest journey had only just begun. The embalmers were responsible for making sure that journey could continue safely. A single mistake might damage the body forever, and if the body could not be preserved, many believed the soul itself might struggle to reach eternity. It was an enormous responsibility, one requiring remarkable skill, patience, and unwavering attention to detail. Contrary to what we sometimes imagine, embalmers did not work inside pyramids or deep within mysterious tombs. Most carried out their work in specialized buildings known today as embalming workshops, usually located close to cemeteries on the western bank of the Nile. This western location was no coincidence. The sun always set in the west, and for the Egyptians, the setting sun symbolized death before its rebirth the following morning. Just as the sun disappeared below the horizon only to rise again, they believed human life followed a similar pattern. The West, therefore, became closely associated with the journey into the afterlife, making it the natural place for preparing the dead. Recent archaeological discoveries have allowed historians to peek inside some of these workshops for the very first time. Excavations at Saqqara have uncovered rooms filled with pottery jars, stone basins, wooden tables, and traces of fragrant oils that still cling faintly to the ancient vessels after more than 2,000 years. Some jars even carried labels identifying their contents or explaining which part of the body they were intended to treat. It is an extraordinary reminder that these workshops functioned almost like carefully organized laboratories. Every ingredient had its purpose. Every tool had its place. Nothing was left to chance. The people who worked there were highly trained specialists. Mummification was not a skill someone learned over the course of a few weeks. It required years of experience and knowledge passed carefully from one generation to the next. Younger apprentices probably spent countless hours observing experienced embalmers before they were trusted with even the simplest tasks. They learned how to prepare oils, how to wrap linen without damaging the body, how to recognize signs of successful preservation, and how to perform delicate procedures with surprising precision. Much of this knowledge was never written down. Like many skilled professions throughout history, it survived because masters patiently taught apprentices who eventually became masters themselves. Although embalmers possessed practical medical knowledge, their work was deeply religious as well. The preparation of a mummy was accompanied by prayers, blessings, and sacred rituals from beginning to end. Certain priests even participated directly in the process, wearing ceremonial clothing and invoking the protection of powerful gods. Among the most important was Anubis, the jackal-headed god associated with embalming and cemeteries. Ancient Egyptian artwork frequently depicts Anubis carefully tending to a mummy, adjusting its wrappings or standing watch beside the embalming table. To the Egyptians, Anubis was not simply a symbol. He was believed to guide and protect both the embalmers and the deceased throughout this sacred transformation. One member of the embalming team often wore a striking mask shaped like the head of Anubis during important ceremonies. Imagine entering the quiet workshop and seeing a figure dressed in white linen, the black jackal mask gazing solemnly over the body before him. To modern eyes, it might seem theatrical, even slightly unsettling, but for the Egyptians it represented something deeply reassuring. The god himself was symbolically present, overseeing the work and ensuring that everything was carried out according to divine tradition. Every movement became part of a ritual that had been repeated thousands of times before. The workshops themselves must have been filled with unusual scents. Unlike the unpleasant smells many people associate with death, the air was often rich with fragrant substances imported from across the ancient world. Cedar oil arrived from the forests of Lebanon. Myrrh and frankincense traveled north from Arabia and the Horn of Africa. Pine resin, beeswax, juniper, cinnamon, and aromatic herbs were carefully stored in pottery jars lining the shelves. Modern chemical analysis has revealed just how international the embalmer's ingredients really were. Some materials journeyed hundreds, even thousands of kilometers before finally reaching Egypt, demonstrating that mummification relied not only on religious belief, but also on one of the ancient world's vast trading networks. Their tools, by comparison, were surprisingly simple. Bronze knives with razor-sharp edges, carefully carved wooden implements, linen cloths, hooks made for delicate procedures, stone bowls, pottery jars, and brushes formed the heart of the embalmer's equipment. There were no complicated machines, no advanced instruments, and certainly no electricity. Everything depended upon the steady hands and practiced experience of the people performing the work. Looking at these modest tools today, it is astonishing to realize they helped preserve bodies so successfully that many still survive after 3,000 years. The embalmers also had to balance precision with compassion. Families often visited during the long 70-day process, bringing offerings and trusting these specialists with someone they had loved deeply. Although ancient texts rarely describe emotional conversations, it is difficult to imagine that grief simply disappeared because a culture expected death. Mothers still lost children. Husbands still buried wives. Friends still mourned one another. The embalmers were not merely technicians carrying out mechanical tasks. They stood quietly beside countless families during some of the most painful moments of their lives, offering reassurance that their loved one was being carefully prepared for eternity. Yet despite the extraordinary importance of their work, we know surprisingly little about the embalmers themselves. Their names rarely appear in grand inscriptions or temple walls. Kings proudly recorded military victories, priests celebrated great ceremonies, and architects left monuments that still dominate the Egyptian landscape. But the people whose careful hands created the world's most famous mummies largely remained in the background. Their greatest achievement was not fame. It was invisibility. If they did their work perfectly, the person before them would endure for thousands of years, carrying the memory of an entire civilization into the distant future. And in a remarkable twist of history, that quiet success has outlived them all. The embalmers may have vanished into the sands of Egypt long ago, but every perfectly preserved mummy displayed in a museum today stands as silent proof of their extraordinary skill. Thousands of years later, we still marvel at what they accomplished with little more than patience, knowledge, faith, and remarkably steady hands. Once the prayers had been spoken and the grieving family had said their first farewells, the body entered the care of the embalmers. This was the beginning of a remarkable process that would last approximately 70 days, a period carefully refined over centuries of observation and tradition. Every stage followed an established order. There was no rushing, no improvisation, and very little left to chance. The Egyptians believed that preparing someone for eternity deserved the same care and patience as constructing a magnificent temple or carving a royal monument. Time itself became part of the ritual. The first task was surprisingly gentle. Before any preservation could begin, the body was carefully washed. To modern listeners, this may sound like a simple act of cleaning, but for the ancient Egyptians, it carried deep religious meaning. Washing removed not only the dust of everyday life, but also symbolically purified the deceased before they entered the next world. Purity was extremely important in Egyptian religion. Priests washed themselves before entering temples. Sacred objects were cleansed before ceremonies. And now, the person about to begin their eternal journey received the same respectful treatment. The water often came from the river Nile itself, the great lifeline of Egyptian civilization. Stretching for thousands of kilometers through northeastern Africa, the Nile was far more than a river. It provided drinking water, fertile farmland, transportation, fish, reeds for building, and the rich black soil that made Egypt one of the most successful civilizations of the ancient world. The Egyptians believed the river was a divine gift, closely connected with the gods and the cycle of life itself. Washing the body with Nile water, therefore, carried both practical and spiritual significance. It was almost as though the river that had sustained a person throughout life was now gently accompanying them into death. Alongside the water, embalmers frequently used palm wine to cleanse the body. Palm wine, made from the sap of date palms, contained natural alcohol, making it useful for cleaning and reducing contamination long before anyone understood bacteria or microorganisms. The Egyptians certainly did not know about germs in the modern scientific sense. Yet through centuries of experience, they had discovered that certain substances help preserve the body more successfully than plain water alone. Modern researchers have often been struck by how many Egyptian practices, developed through careful observation rather than laboratory science, proved surprisingly effective. The body was then placed upon a specially designed embalming table. Ancient artwork sometimes shows these tables as long stone or wooden platforms with slightly raised edges, allowing liquids to drain away during the preparation. Nearby stood shelves filled with pottery jars, linen cloths, bronze tools, fragrant oils, and carefully labeled ingredients waiting for their turn. Everything had been prepared before the body even arrived. One can almost imagine the quiet efficiency inside the workshop. There was no frantic searching for equipment or hurried last-minute decisions. Every tool rested exactly where generations of embalmers expected to find it. Throughout these early stages, prayers continued almost constantly. Death, to the Egyptians, was never viewed as merely a physical event. Every practical action carried a spiritual companion. As one embalmer carefully washed the hands of the deceased, another priest might quietly recite sacred words asking the gods to protect those same hands in the next life. As fragrant oils were gently rubbed onto the skin, prayers invited divine beings to recognize and bless the individual who would soon stand before them. Practical skill and religious devotion were never separated. They existed side by side, each strengthening the other. Many of the oils themselves were precious imports, arriving in Egypt after long journeys across deserts and seas. Cedar oil from the mountains of Lebanon was especially valued, while myrrh and frankincense reached Egypt through ancient trade routes stretching deep into Arabia and East Africa. Their rich, pleasant aromas filled the embalming workshop, replacing the harsh odors people might expect with something surprisingly fragrant. Recent chemical studies of ancient mummies have confirmed that these aromatic substances were used in remarkable quantities. Even after thousands of years, traces remain within the wrappings, allowing scientists to identify ingredients that once perfumed the workshops of ancient Egypt. As the body was cleaned, embalmers carefully examined it from head to toe. Every person presented unique challenges. Age, health, injuries, and even the season of death could influence how the preservation process unfolded. This required considerable experience. The embalmers were not simply following a written instruction manual. They relied upon knowledge accumulated through generations of careful practice. Each body demanded slightly different decisions, and experienced specialists learned to recognize subtle details that younger apprentices might easily overlook. One detail that often surprises modern audiences is how calm and respectful the entire process appears to have been. Popular films frequently portray ancient embalming as something dark, frightening, or surrounded by sinister rituals. The historical evidence paints a rather different picture. The workshops were places of careful craftsmanship and quiet reverence. Families entrusted their loved ones to these specialists because they believed the embalmers were offering the greatest gift imaginable, the chance to live forever. Rather than fearing these workshops, many Egyptians probably viewed them with profound respect. They were places where ordinary human hands worked in partnership with the gods. Only after the body had been thoroughly washed, purified, inspected, and blessed would the embalmers begin the most famous and technically demanding stages of mummification. These were the procedures that have fascinated historians for centuries and continue to amaze medical experts even today. The next step required astonishing precision, delicate tools, and knowledge unlike anything found elsewhere in the ancient world. It involved one of history's most unusual surgical procedures, a method so distinctive that even today it immediately brings ancient Egypt to mind. The journey to eternity had begun gently, with water, prayers, and fragrant oils. Soon, however, The embalmers would demonstrate the extraordinary techniques that transformed ordinary human remains into the timeless mummies that continue to survive more than 3,000 years later. Of all the stages involved in mummification, none has captured the imagination of historians quite as much as what came next. It is the part that almost everyone has heard about, yet very few people fully understand. Somewhere inside the quiet embalming workshop, surrounded by jars of fragrant oils and neatly folded linen, the embalmers prepared to perform one of the most extraordinary procedures of the ancient world. Their goal was not surgery in the modern sense, nor was it an attempt to understand the human brain as doctors do today. Instead, they were solving a practical problem that centuries of experience had taught them was essential for preserving the body. Surprisingly, the solution began with the nose. To modern ears, removing the brain through the nostrils sounds almost impossible. Surely such a delicate organ could only be reached by opening the skull itself. Yet the Egyptians developed a method that avoided large visible cuts to the head, allowing the face to remain largely unchanged. This mattered greatly because preserving a person's appearance was considered extremely important. The soul, they believed, should still be able to recognize the body when it returned. Damaging the face unnecessarily would have defeated much of the purpose of mummification. The procedure required remarkable precision, using a long, slender instrument, often made of bronze or carefully shaped metal. The embalmer gently inserted the tool through one of the nostrils. The instrument passed upward until it reached the thin bone separating the nasal cavity from the inside of the skull. With practiced movements developed over generations, this fragile barrier was carefully pierced. It was delicate work, requiring experience rather than force. One careless movement could damage the face, something every skilled embalmer hoped to avoid. Once access had been gained, the brain itself was gradually broken down inside the skull using specially designed hooks and other fine instruments. Ancient writers sometimes describe this stage in rather dramatic language, but archaeological evidence suggests it was carried out methodically and patiently. The softened tissue was then removed little by little through the nostrils. In some cases, the embalmers may have gently tilted the body to assist the process, while rinsing the skull with cleansing liquids helped remove any remaining material. Modern forensic examinations of mummies have even revealed subtle variations in technique, suggesting that different embalming workshops developed their own preferred methods over the centuries. To us, this procedure naturally raises an obvious question. Why remove the brain at all? After all, today we understand that the brain controls thought, memory, personality, movement, and virtually every aspect of human life. Surely the Egyptians must have recognized its importance. Surprisingly, they did not view the brain as the center of intelligence in the way modern science does. Although they certainly knew it existed, they believed the heart played the far more significant role. The heart was seen as the seat of memory, wisdom, emotion, morality, and identity. When a person loved, feared, remembered, or made important decisions, the Egyptians believed those qualities resided within the heart rather than the brain. This belief explains one of the most fascinating choices made during mummification. While the brain was usually removed, the heart almost always remained exactly where it was. The embalmers treated it with extraordinary respect because they believed it would be needed during the most important moment awaiting every soul in the afterlife. According to Egyptian religion, the deceased would eventually stand before the god Osiris, where their heart would be weighed against the feather of Ma'at, the goddess representing truth, justice, and cosmic order. If the heart proved light and pure, the person could enter eternal life. If it was heavy with wrongdoing, terrifying consequences awaited. We will return to that remarkable ceremony later. But even now, it helps explain why preserving the heart mattered so deeply. Interestingly, not every mummy followed exactly the same pattern. Archaeologists have discovered occasional examples where traces of brain tissue remained inside the skull, suggesting that earlier embalmers did not always remove it completely. During Egypt's earliest periods, the brain was often left untouched altogether because preservation techniques were still developing. Only over centuries did the transnasal method become increasingly refined until it became one of the defining features of elite mummification. Like any craft, embalming evolved gradually through observation, experimentation, and the accumulated experience of countless generations. The empty space inside the skull also required attention. Once the brain had been removed, embalmers often filled the cavity with linen, resin, sawdust, or other materials designed to help the head retain its natural shape. Without this support, the face might gradually collapse inward during the long drying process. Again, appearance mattered enormously. Families wanted their loved one to remain recognizable, and the embalmers took considerable pride in achieving that goal. Looking at many well-preserved royal mummies today, one can still recognize surprisingly distinct facial features despite the passage of more than 3,000 years. Their success speaks volumes about the remarkable care invested in every stage of the process. To modern medical professionals, the Egyptians' understanding of anatomy is often both impressive and puzzling. They correctly identified which tissues decayed most rapidly and developed highly effective methods for preventing that decay, yet they misunderstood the biological role of some organs entirely. It is a reminder that practical experience and scientific theory do not always develop together. The embalmers did not possess microscopes or anatomy textbooks, but they had centuries of careful observation. They knew what preserved a body successfully, even if they explained those results through religious beliefs rather than modern biology. There is something quietly extraordinary about imagining this scene inside the embalming workshop. No loud conversations filled the room. No audience watched in fascination. Only experienced hands moved patiently beneath the warm Egyptian sun, carrying out a procedure unlike anything else in the ancient world. Every movement reflected knowledge handed down from master to apprentice across countless generations. They could never have imagined that, thousands of years later, doctors armed with CT scanners and advanced imaging technology would still study their work with admiration, uncovering the remarkable skill hidden beneath layers of ancient linen. Yet despite how famous this stage has become, the embalmers knew their work was still far from complete. Removing the brain was only one step in preparing the body for eternity. The greatest challenge still lay ahead. Inside the chest and abdomen remained the organs most vulnerable to decay, and preserving them required another astonishing innovation, one that introduced some of the most iconic objects in all of Egyptian archaeology, the beautiful canopic jars. With the brain carefully removed and the body purified, the embalmers turned their attention to the chest and abdomen. This was perhaps the most delicate stage of the entire process. Unlike the brain, which the Egyptians believed held little importance after death, the organs within the body presented a different challenge altogether. They were both spiritually significant and biologically troublesome. Through generations of careful observation, embalmers had learned that these soft internal organs were the first parts of the body to decay. If left untouched, they would quickly undo all the careful work that had already begun. Preserving eternity meant preventing that decay before it had a chance to take hold. Rather than making large openings across the body, the embalmers worked with remarkable restraint. A small incision was carefully made on the left side of the abdomen using an exceptionally sharp blade. Ancient Greek writers later claimed that this cut was traditionally made with an Ethiopian stone knife, probably a blade fashioned from obsidian or another extremely sharp volcanic stone. Whether every workshop followed exactly this practice remains uncertain, but archaeology confirms that the incision itself was surprisingly modest. The Egyptians valued the body's appearance, and the smaller the opening, the easier it would be to restore the body to a natural form once the preservation was complete. Through this single opening, the embalmers gently removed 4 major organs: the liver, the lungs, the stomach, and the intestines. Each required careful handling because these organs were not discarded as useless. On the contrary, they were considered important parts of the individual and would continue to play a role in the afterlife. The embalmers, therefore, treated them almost as respectfully as they treated the body itself. Once removed, the organs were thoroughly cleaned, prepared, and eventually dried using the same remarkable methods that would later preserve the rest of the body. One organ, however, was almost always left exactly where it belonged. The heart remained safely inside the chest. To modern listeners, this may seem like an unusual decision. The heart is, after all, another soft organ capable of decaying. But to the Egyptians, removing it would have been unthinkable. The heart was not simply a pump circulating blood around the body. It was believed to be the very center of a person's existence. Every memory, every emotion, every act of kindness, every mistake, every hope, every fear, and every decision made throughout life was thought to reside within it. If the heart were missing, how could the gods judge the person's life fairly? Without a heart, the deceased would arrive in the next world incomplete. This belief reached its climax during one of the most beautiful scenes in Egyptian mythology, the weighing of the heart. According to the Book of the Dead, every soul eventually entered the Hall of Two Truths, where the god Anubis carefully placed the person's heart on one side of a great pair of scales. On the opposite side rested a single white feather belonging to Ma'at, the goddess of truth, justice, harmony, and cosmic balance. If the scales balanced, or if the heart proved lighter than the feather, the soul was declared pure and worthy of eternal life. If the heart was weighed down by dishonesty, cruelty, or wrongdoing, it faced a far darker fate. Waiting beside the scales sat a terrifying creature known as Ammit, part crocodile, part lion, and part hippopotamus, ready to consume the hearts of those who failed the test. To the Egyptians, this was not simply a frightening story. It was a profound reminder that living a good and honest life mattered just as much as receiving a proper burial. The 4 organs removed from the body were placed into some of the most recognizable objects in Egyptian archaeology, the canopic jars. These beautifully crafted containers have become almost as famous as the mummies themselves. Early examples often had simple lids, but over time, they evolved into elegant vessels topped with carved heads representing 4 protective deities known as the 4 sons of Horus. Each god became the eternal guardian of one specific organ, watching over it throughout the endless years of the afterlife. The first was Seti, depicted with a human head. He protected the liver and was associated with the goddess Isis, one of Egypt's most beloved deities. Next came Hapi, whose baboon head guarded the lungs under the protection of the goddess Nephthys. The stomach belonged to Tef, recognized by his jackal head, and watched over by the goddess Neith. Finally came Keba-Sinuf, whose falcon head protected the intestines with the guidance of the goddess Selkut. Together, these 4 divine guardians surrounded the deceased, ensuring that every vital part of the body remained safe throughout eternity. The jars themselves were often works of extraordinary craftsmanship. Wealthy families commissioned examples carved from fine alabaster, polished limestone, or beautifully painted wood. Hieroglyphs covered their surfaces with protective prayers, the names of the deceased, and magical formulas asking the gods to defend the precious organs inside. Looking at these jars today in museum galleries, it is easy to admire their artistry without immediately realizing their practical purpose. Yet for the Egyptians, they were both sacred containers and powerful symbols of divine protection. Interestingly, Egyptian burial customs evolved over time. During later periods, embalmers sometimes returned to preserved organs to the body after they had been carefully treated, while still placing empty canopic jars inside the tomb for symbolic and religious reasons. This fascinating change reminds us that Egyptian civilization lasted for more than 3,000 years. Traditions were remarkably consistent, but they were never completely frozen in time. Like every civilization, Egypt slowly adapted its customs while preserving the beliefs that mattered most. Once the organs had been removed, another important task remained. The now empty body cavity could not simply be left hollow. The embalmers carefully rinsed it using palm wine and aromatic oils before filling the space with fragrant materials such as linen, resin, sawdust, myrrh, cinnamon, or other sweet-smelling substances. These fillings help the body retain its natural shape during the long drying process, while also reducing unpleasant odors and adding another layer of preservation. Recent scientific examinations have shown that many of these resins possess natural antibacterial and antifungal properties, making them remarkably effective despite the embalmers having no knowledge of microscopic organisms. Once again, centuries of observation had quietly led them toward methods that modern science now understands surprisingly well. By the end of this stage, the body had already undergone an astonishing transformation. It had been carefully washed, blessed, cleansed, relieved of the organs most vulnerable to decay, and prepared with fragrant oils gathered from distant corners of the ancient world. Yet despite all this effort, the greatest challenge still remained. Even without its internal organs, the body still contained one thing that every embalmer feared above all else: moisture. As long as water remained trapped within the body's tissues, decay could continue its slow and relentless work. To truly preserve someone for eternity, the embalmers needed to accomplish something extraordinary. They needed to remove almost every drop of moisture without destroying the body's form. Their solution was so effective that thousands of years later, modern scientists still marvel at its success. The secret lay in an unassuming white mineral gathered from the deserts of Egypt. Its name was natron. By the time the body emerged from its long rest beneath the natron, it had already survived the greatest challenge of the entire process. The dangerous moisture that caused decay was gone, leaving behind a body that was astonishingly well preserved. To a modern observer, it might have appeared fragile, almost delicate, its skin drawn tightly over the bones by weeks of careful drying. Yet the embalmers did not see a lifeless body before them. They believed they were looking at someone standing on the very threshold of eternal life. What happened next was not simply about protecting the body from physical damage. It was about preparing it spiritually, magically, and symbolically for the endless journey that lay ahead. The drying process had left the body much lighter than before, and in many cases the embalmers now gently restored some of its natural shape. The empty spaces inside the chest and abdomen, already filled with fragrant materials, were checked once more. Additional linen, resin-soaked cloth, sawdust, or soft packing materials might be carefully inserted wherever necessary to help the body retain a lifelike appearance. Hollow cheeks could be subtly supported from within. Fingers and toes were adjusted in natural positions. Every small detail mattered because the Egyptians believed the deceased should remain recognizable, both to the gods and to their own soul. Only after these final adjustments were complete did the wrapping begin. This stage demanded extraordinary patience. It was not the work of a single afternoon, nor was it simply a matter of rolling someone inside a long sheet of cloth. Wrapping a mummy was a careful art that could take many days. Every strip of linen had a purpose, every knot carried meaning, and every layer contributed to the body's protection. Ancient texts and archaeological discoveries suggest that some elite mummies were wrapped using hundreds of individual linen bandages. If all the strips were laid end to end, they could stretch for several hundred meters. The sheer amount of fabric involved was remarkable. Linen itself held special significance in ancient Egypt. Woven from flax grown along the fertile banks of the Nile, it was considered a clean and pure material. Priests wore linen garments during religious ceremonies. Temple furnishings were often made from linen, and now the same sacred fabric surrounded the body of the deceased. Wealthy families frequently donated fine household linens that had belonged to the person during life. Some wrappings were even made from cherished clothing, giving familiar fabrics a final purpose in preparing their owner for eternity. The embalmers worked methodically from one part of the body to the next. Fingers were wrapped individually before the hands were enclosed together. Each toe received its own delicate covering before the feet disappeared beneath broader layers of linen. The arms, legs, head, and torso followed in careful succession. Resin, heated until it became sticky, was brushed between many of the layers. Acting almost like a natural glue, it held the wrappings firmly together while adding another valuable layer of protection against moisture and decay. Thousands of years later, archaeologists still encounter these hardened resins, their rich aroma sometimes lingering faintly despite the passing centuries. As the wrapping progressed, something else quietly took place. The embalmers began placing small protective objects between the layers of linen. These were amulets, tiny charms crafted from gold, faience, precious stones, or carved semi-precious minerals. To modern eyes, they may resemble simple pieces of jewelry, but for the Egyptians, each one carried powerful symbolic meaning. Every amulet acted as a form of spiritual protection, carefully positioned to guard a specific part of the body or assist the deceased during their journey through the afterlife. Among the most famous was the scarab beetle. Anyone who has visited an Egyptian museum has likely seen these beautiful carvings, their polished surfaces often engraved with delicate hieroglyphs. The scarab represented rebirth and renewal because Egyptians observed dung beetles rolling perfect balls across the desert sands, a movement they associated with the sun traveling across the sky each day. A particularly important version, known as the heart scarab, was placed over the chest. It carried inscriptions asking the heart not to speak against its owner during the final judgment before Osiris. It was, in a sense, a quiet plea for mercy and truth. Another popular amulet was the Eye of Horus, a symbol still recognized around the world today. According to mythology, Horus lost his eye during a great struggle with the god Set before it was magically restored. As a result, the Eye of Horus became a symbol of healing, protection, and wholeness. Placing it within the mummy's wrappings invited those same blessings upon the deceased. Other amulets represented pillars of stability, knots symbolizing the protection of Isis, tiny ladders for ascending into heaven, or miniature deities standing watch over different parts of the body. A wealthy mummy might contain dozens, even hundreds, of such charms hidden beneath the linen, each quietly performing its own sacred duty. Throughout this entire process, priests continued reciting prayers from sacred funerary texts. Among the most famous of these is what we now call the Book of the Dead, though the ancient Egyptians themselves knew it by a much longer and more beautiful title, the Book of Coming Forth by Day. Rather than being a single fixed book, it was a collection of spells, hymns, instructions, and prayers designed to guide the deceased safely through the challenges awaiting them in the next world. Some passages were written on papyrus scrolls placed inside the tomb. Others appeared directly upon coffins, tomb walls, or even strips of linen. The spoken words accompanying the wrapping were believed to strengthen the magical protection surrounding every layer. One particularly moving ceremony took place after the wrapping had been completed, known as the opening of the mouth ritual. It was intended to restore the deceased's senses for the afterlife. Using carefully crafted ceremonial tools, priests symbolically touched the mummy's mouth, eyes, ears, and nose while reciting ancient prayers. This ritual was not meant to revive the dead physically. Instead, it ensured that in the next life they would once again be able to breathe the fresh air of paradise, see the beauty of the gods, hear the voices of loved ones, speak prayers, and enjoy the food and drink offered within their tomb. It was a deeply hopeful ceremony, reminding everyone present that death represented not an ending, but a continuation. At last, after weeks of painstaking work, the transformation was complete. The ordinary human body that had entered the embalming workshop 70 days earlier had become something entirely different. Protected beneath hundreds of carefully arranged linen bandages, strengthened by fragrant resins, watched over by dozens of sacred amulets, and blessed through countless prayers, the mummy was now ready for the final stage of its earthly journey. Soon it would leave the quiet workshop for the last time, carried in solemn procession toward a beautifully prepared tomb where family, priests, and mourners waited to say their final goodbye. But before the doors of eternity could close, one final journey still remained: the funeral itself. one of the grandest and most meaningful ceremonies in all of ancient Egypt. After 70 days of careful preparation, the work of the embalmers was finally complete. The body had been washed with sacred water from the Nile, cleansed with fragrant oils gathered from distant lands, carefully dried beneath mountains of natron, wrapped in hundreds of layers of fine linen, protected by dozens of magical amulets, and blessed with prayers that had echoed through Egyptian temples for centuries. The quiet workshops that had witnessed this remarkable transformation now stood still once more. Their task was finished, but for the family of the deceased, the most emotional day of all had finally arrived. It was time to leave the embalming house and begin the final journey to the tomb. Unlike many modern funerals, which are often completed within a single afternoon, Egyptian funeral ceremonies were elaborate public events that involved family members, priests, musicians, professional mourners, servants, and sometimes hundreds of participants depending on the status of the deceased. The funeral was not simply about saying goodbye. It was about ensuring that every religious obligation had been fulfilled before the soul entered eternity. Every prayer spoken, every offering presented, and every ritual completed increased the hope that the deceased would safely reach the beautiful world beyond death. As dawn broke over the Nile, preparations quietly began. The mummy, now resting inside an inner coffin, was carefully lifted onto a ceremonial sled or wooden bier. In many paintings found inside tombs, these sleds are beautifully decorated and often pulled by oxen or groups of servants using thick ropes. The procession moved slowly through the landscape, leaving the fertile green valley behind and heading west toward the desert cliffs where generations of Egyptians had built their tombs. The west remained deeply symbolic. Just as the sun disappeared into the western horizon every evening before rising again the next morning, so too would the deceased enter the west in the hope of rising into eternal life. The procession itself was a remarkable sight. Priests dressed in spotless white linen walked near the front, carrying incense burners that filled the air with sweet-smelling smoke. Family members followed closely behind, many openly weeping for the loved one they would soon leave forever. Wealthier funerals included musicians playing soft melodies on harps and flutes, while others carried flowers, baskets of bread, jars of beer, fruits, and offerings that would later be placed inside the tomb. Some funerals even employed professional mourners, women whose role was to express grief through loud cries, songs, and ritual gestures. To modern audiences, this may seem unusual, but in ancient Egypt, such displays were believed to honor the deceased and acknowledge the profound sadness of parting. Ancient Egyptian artwork often depicts two women walking at the head of these funeral processions, representing the goddesses Isis and Nephthys. According to mythology, these sisters had mourned deeply over the death of Osiris before helping restore him to eternal life. Their presence during funerals symbolized hope that every deceased person might follow the same sacred path. Whether actual women dressed as these goddesses participated in every ceremony, or whether the images were largely symbolic remains uncertain. But the connection between the myth of Osiris and every Egyptian funeral was unmistakable. As the procession approached the cemetery, the towering tomb came into view. For kings, this might be an enormous pyramid in the Old Kingdom or a hidden rock-cut tomb deep within the Valley of the Kings during later periods. For wealthy officials, beautifully decorated underground chambers awaited beneath elegant stone chapels. Even more modest families prepared carefully built tombs whenever possible, believing that a permanent resting place offered the greatest security for eternity. Regardless of size, every tomb represented far more than a grave. It was a house for everlasting life. Before the mummy entered its final resting place, one of the most important ceremonies of the entire funeral took place. Known as the opening of the mouth ritual, it marked the symbolic moment when the deceased regained the ability to experience life once more in the next world. A priest, often wearing the distinctive mask of Anubis, approached the mummy carrying specially crafted ceremonial instruments. With slow and deliberate movements, he gently touched the lips, eyes, ears, and nose while reciting ancient prayers. These actions were believed to restore the senses. The deceased would once again be able to breathe fresh air, speak with the gods, hear sacred hymns, see the beauty of paradise, and enjoy the food and drink that awaited them in eternity. To those gathered around the tomb, this was not merely symbolic theater. It was one of the most essential moments in preparing someone for everlasting life. Once these sacred rituals had been completed, attention turned to the coffin itself. Egyptian coffins became increasingly elaborate over the centuries. Early burials often used simple wooden boxes, but later periods saw the creation of magnificent anthropoid coffins shaped like the human body. Brightly painted faces looked serenely outward, while hieroglyphic inscriptions covered every surface with prayers, protective spells, and the names of the deceased. Wealthy individuals were frequently buried inside several nested coffins, each fitting perfectly within the next like a set of beautifully crafted wooden shells. Finally, these coffins were placed inside a massive stone sarcophagus, carved from granite, limestone, or other durable materials capable of surviving for thousands of years. The word sarcophagus itself comes from the Greek language and literally means flesh-eating stone, though the Egyptians themselves simply regarded it as the strongest possible protection for the body within. Many royal sarcophagi weighed several tons and required tremendous engineering skill to transport into the tomb before construction was completed. Once positioned, they would never be moved again. At least that was the hope. As family members gathered for their final farewell, offerings filled the burial chamber. Baskets of bread, roasted meats, onions, figs, grapes, jars of wine and beer, honey, oils, perfumes, clothing, sandals, walking sticks, furniture, jewelry, cosmetics, board games, musical instruments, and countless everyday possessions were carefully arranged around the coffin. None of these objects were included merely as decoration. The Egyptians genuinely believed they would continue serving the deceased in the next world. If someone enjoyed music during life, why should eternity be silent? If they appreciated comfortable furniture, why should paradise offer anything less? The afterlife was imagined not as an abstract spiritual realm, but as a perfected continuation of earthly existence. Small servant figurines known today as Ushabti were often placed alongside these offerings. These charming little statues represented workers who would magically come to life if the deceased were ever asked to perform labor in the afterlife. Rather than forcing the owner to work in the eternal fields, the Ushabti would answer on their behalf. Wealthy tombs sometimes contained hundreds of these tiny helpers, enough to provide assistance every day of the year. It is a wonderfully practical detail that reflects the Egyptians' remarkable ability to imagine eternity in very human terms. Eventually, the moment arrived that every family had been quietly avoiding. The mummy was gently lowered into its final resting place. Heavy stone lids were carefully slid across the sarcophagus. Priests spoke their last blessings. Family members offered final prayers and perhaps one last lingering glance before slowly leaving the chamber. Outside, workers sealed the entrance with great blocks of stone, hoping to protect the tomb forever from thieves, animals, floods, and the endless passage of time. As silence settled over the tomb, the funeral appeared to be over. But according to Egyptian belief, something far more important had only just begun. Beyond the sealed doorway, beyond the darkness of the burial chamber, beyond the reach of the living, the soul now prepared to begin its greatest journey of all, a journey through the mysterious landscape of the afterlife, where gods waited, challenges lay ahead, and eternity itself stretched beyond the horizon. For the ancient Egyptians, a tomb was never intended to be a place of sadness or emptiness. To modern visitors, walking into one of these ancient chambers can feel strangely silent. Stone walls surround us. Narrow corridors disappear into darkness. Painted figures stare quietly across thousands of years, and the air carries the stillness of a place undisturbed for centuries. It is easy to think of these spaces simply as graves. But the Egyptians would have been surprised by that idea. They did not build tombs as places for the dead to remain forever motionless. They built them as homes, permanent homes, carefully designed for an eternal life they believed would continue just beyond the reach of human eyes. This is why so much effort went into decorating even relatively modest tombs. The walls were not left bare. Instead, artists spent months, sometimes years, covering every available surface with colorful scenes from everyday Egyptian life. Farmers harvested grain beneath the warm sun. Fishermen cast their nets into the Nile. Bakers prepared fresh bread. Brewers filled jars with beer. Musicians played elegant harps while dancers entertained guests at lively celebrations. Families embraced one another. Servants carried baskets overflowing with fruit. Priests presented offerings to the gods. Looking around these chambers today almost feels like opening a beautifully illustrated storybook, one that quietly preserves ordinary moments from a civilization that vanished thousands of years ago. To us, these paintings appear decorative or historical. To the Egyptians, they possess something far more powerful. They believed that images themselves carried magical potential. A painted loaf of bread could become real in the afterlife. A painted servant could continue working forever. A painted river could provide fish for eternity. Through sacred words and religious belief, the artwork inside a tomb was thought to come alive in the next world, ensuring the deceased would never lack food, comfort, or companionship. In this way, every carefully painted wall became a kind of eternal promise. Furniture formed another important part of the burial. Archaeologists have discovered beds, chairs, stools, footrests, tables, wooden chests, and beautifully carved cabinets placed carefully inside many Egyptian tombs. Some of these objects were simple and practical, while others displayed extraordinary craftsmanship, inlaid with ivory, ebony, or gold. They were not buried because people wished to display wealth one final time. Rather, the Egyptians genuinely believed these possessions would accompany the deceased into eternity. If someone had enjoyed resting in a comfortable chair during life, why should they spend forever without one? The afterlife, in Egyptian thought, was meant to be familiar, comfortable, and abundant. Clothing was packed just as carefully. Fine linen robes, sandals woven from papyrus, elaborate wigs, jewelry, belts, and decorative collars often accompanied the mummy. Ancient Egyptians cared greatly about personal appearance. Clean linen symbolized purity, and jewelry reflected both beauty and status. These items would allow the deceased to present themselves properly before the gods and continue dressing with dignity throughout eternity. Looking through museum collections today, it is remarkable how finely woven some of these garments remain, their delicate fibers surviving across millennia thanks to Egypt's dry climate. Food offerings filled nearly every burial chamber. Bread appeared in countless shapes and sizes. Large jars held beer, the everyday drink of ancient Egypt. There were baskets of onions, dates, figs, grapes, lentils, garlic, and grain. Wealthier tombs sometimes included roasted ducks, cuts of beef, fish, honey, cakes, wine, and fragrant oils. Many of these foods have survived in astonishing condition, allowing archaeologists to study not only Egyptian agriculture, but also the daily diet of people who lived more than 3,000 years ago. The Egyptians believed these offerings would nourish the Ka, the spiritual life force that continued existing after death. Family members even returned regularly to present fresh offerings, maintaining a lasting connection between the living and those who had passed on. Some tombs also contained remarkably personal belongings. Combs still held strands of hair. Cosmetic jars preserved traces of ancient perfumes and eye makeup. Writing palettes rested beside carefully sharpened reed pens, ready for scribes who expected to continue recording knowledge forever. Hunters were buried with bows and arrows. Craftsmen sometimes received their favorite tools. Musicians rested beside beautifully crafted instruments. It is touching to realize that these were not random collections of valuables. They reflected individual lives, personal interests, and familiar routines that families hoped would continue unchanged in paradise. One of the most fascinating discoveries inside many Egyptian tombs is the presence of board games. Among the most popular was Seti I, a game played across Egypt for thousands of years. Beautiful wooden game boards have been uncovered beside mummies, complete with carved playing pieces carefully arranged, as though someone had simply stepped away for a moment. Over time, Seti became more than entertainment. Egyptians came to believe the game symbolized the soul's journey through the afterlife, with each successful move representing progress toward eternal peace. It is rather comforting to imagine someone preparing for forever by packing not only food and clothing, but also their favorite game. For the wealthiest Egyptians, transportation was included as well. Archaeologists have uncovered full-size chariots, elegant wooden boats, and even dismantled ships buried beside important rulers. The most famous example is the magnificent solar boat discovered beside the Great Pyramid of Khufu. More than 40 meters long and painstakingly reconstructed from over 1,000 wooden pieces, it demonstrates the astonishing lengths Egyptians went to in preparing for eternity. Whether intended for travel across the heavenly waters alongside the sun god Ra, or simply as transportation in the next life, such vessels reveal the extraordinary imagination that shaped Egyptian funerary beliefs. Animals, too, sometimes accompanied their owners into the tomb. Faithful dogs, beloved cats, hunting falcons, monkeys, gazelles, and even carefully mummified pets have been discovered resting beside their human companions. These finds remind us that affection between people and animals is not a modern invention. Ancient Egyptians loved their pets just as deeply as many people do today, and they hoped those companions would continue sharing eternity with them. Some pets received tiny coffins of their own, complete with careful wrappings and respectful burials that mirrored those of humans. And then, of course, there was treasure. Gold necklaces shimmered beneath torchlight. Bracelets set with lapis lazuli and turquoise rested inside carved wooden chests. Rings, amulets, ceremonial daggers, carved statues, alabaster vessels, ivory boxes, and precious gemstones surrounded many wealthy burials. Yet even here, it is important not to misunderstand the Egyptian purpose. These objects were not buried merely because people wished to hide their wealth underground. Gold held special religious significance because it never tarnished. The Egyptians believed it resembled the eternal flesh of the gods themselves. Its brilliance symbolized immortality, making it an especially fitting material for someone preparing to live forever. As the final offerings were arranged, priests quietly sealed the burial chamber. The flickering light of oil lamps disappeared. Heavy stone doors closed. Workers carefully concealed entrances beneath sand, rubble, or carved stone blocks. Families slowly made their way back toward the fertile Nile Valley, carrying with them memories of someone they hoped would now enjoy everlasting happiness among the gods. For a brief moment, it must have seemed that the tomb would remain untouched forever. In many cases, almost did, but history has a curious habit of surprising us. Some tombs remained hidden for thousands of years, their treasures waiting patiently beneath the desert sands. Others attracted visitors much sooner. Visitors who cared very little about eternal life and far more about the glitter of gold. For even in ancient Egypt, there were those willing to risk everything for the riches hidden behind sealed stone doors. For thousands of years, the tombs of ancient Egypt lay hidden beneath drifting desert sands. Kingdoms rose and fell. The Greek Empire swept across the eastern Mediterranean. The Romans ruled Egypt for centuries. Later came Arab dynasties, Ottoman governors, European explorers, and eventually modern archaeologists. Entire civilizations appeared and disappeared while the silent occupants of Egypt's tombs remained undisturbed. They had been prepared with extraordinary care, wrapped in linen, surrounded by protective prayers, and sealed away from the outside world. Their embalmers believed they were preserving them for eternity. In a way, they succeeded far beyond anything they could ever have imagined. Thousands of years later, we still know many of these individuals by name. Perhaps no mummy has become more famous than Tutankhamun, often affectionately called King Tut. Curiously, during his own lifetime, Tutankhamun was not one of Egypt's greatest rulers. He became pharaoh at around 9 years old and died before reaching his 20th birthday. His reign lasted only about a decade and was overshadowed by much more powerful kings both before and after him. Had history followed its usual course, he might have remained a relatively minor figure remembered only by specialists. Instead, one remarkable stroke of luck transformed him into the most famous pharaoh on Earth. In 1922, British archaeologist Howard Carter made one of the greatest archaeological discoveries in history. After years of painstaking searching in the Valley of the Kings, Carter uncovered the entrance to a tomb unlike almost any ever found before. While most royal tombs had been robbed centuries earlier, Tutankhamun's burial remained astonishingly intact. When Carter finally peered through a small opening using nothing more than a candle, his patron eagerly asked whether he could see anything inside. Carter's famous reply has since become part of archaeological legend. "Yes," he reportedly answered. "Wonderful things." And wonderful they certainly were. Inside the tomb lay more than 5,000 objects, carefully arranged exactly as they had been placed over 3,000 years earlier. There were golden chariots, elegant furniture, ceremonial weapons, statues, clothing, musical instruments, jewelry, food offerings, perfumes, sandals, and beautifully carved shrines. At the center rested a magnificent series of nested coffins, each fitting inside the next until finally, beneath solid gold, lay the carefully wrapped body of the young king himself. His famous funerary mask has become one of the world's most recognizable works of art. Fashioned from more than 10 kilograms of solid gold and inlaid with lapis lazuli, quartz, obsidian, colored glass, and semi-precious stones, the mask was designed not merely as decoration, but as a magical protection for the king's face. Looking into its calm expression today, it is easy to forget that beneath it rested the preserved body of a teenager whose reign ended more than 33 centuries ago. Modern technology has allowed scientists to learn astonishing details about Tutankhamun without unwrapping or damaging his mummy. CT scans reveal that he stood around 5 feet 6 inches tall, possessed a slight build, and likely suffered from several health problems. Studies suggest he may have walked with the aid of a cane, and dozens of beautifully carved walking sticks discovered inside his tomb support that possibility. DNA analysis has also helped researchers better understand his family relationships, revealing the complex royal lineage that characterized many Egyptian dynasties. Rather than destroying history to study it, modern science now allows us to gently look beneath the linen while leaving the mummy safely preserved. If Tutankhamun represents youthful mystery, then Ramesses II represents power itself. Often known as Ramesses the Great, he ruled Egypt for an astonishing 66 years, one of the longest reigns in recorded history. By the time he died, he was believed to have lived into his 90s, an extraordinary age for the ancient world. During his lifetime, he oversaw enormous building projects, expanded Egypt's influence, fought famous battles, and fathered more than 100 children. His colossal statues still tower above visitors at temples, such as Abu Simbel, their immense faces gazing across the desert exactly as they have done for over 3,000 years. Ramesses' mummy survives today in remarkable condition, allowing researchers to study the physical remains of one of history's greatest rulers. His reddish hair, preserved despite the passing centuries, still attracts attention from scientists and museum visitors alike. Examinations have revealed severe arthritis, worn teeth, and signs of the many physical challenges that accompanied such an exceptionally long life. Yet perhaps the most extraordinary chapter of his story occurred not in ancient Egypt, but in the 20th century. During the 1970s, conservators discovered that Ramesses' mummy was beginning to deteriorate due to fungal growth. To save one of the world's greatest historical treasures, the Egyptian government arranged for the mummy to travel to France for specialist treatment. Remarkably, because international law required proper documentation for anyone entering another country, Ramesses II was issued an official Egyptian passport. His occupation reportedly listed him simply as king deceased. It is one of history's most delightful ironies that a man who ruled Egypt 3,000 years ago became one of the very few mummies ever to travel internationally with a passport. Another beautifully preserved royal mummy belongs to Seti I, father of Ramesses the Great. Many Egyptologists consider his mummy among the finest examples of ancient embalming ever discovered. His facial features remain astonishingly recognizable, with delicate skin, carefully preserved ears, and an expression so peaceful that early explorers were deeply moved upon first seeing him. Looking at Seti today creates an almost unsettling connection across time. Rather than appearing as an abstract historical figure, he resembles an ordinary human being who might simply be sleeping peacefully after a long day's work. Not every famous mummy belonged to a pharaoh. One of the most fascinating discoveries of recent decades concerns individuals whose names have been almost completely forgotten by history. Through careful study of inscriptions, DNA evidence, and CT imaging, archaeologists have identified priests, noblewomen, musicians, officials, temple singers, and even children whose remarkably preserved remains continue telling stories thousands of years after their deaths. Every mummy offers a unique glimpse into ancient Egyptian life. Some reveal healed broken bones, evidence of successful surgeries, or signs of diseases that doctors still recognize today. Others preserve hairstyles, tattoos, fingernails, eyelashes, and even traces of cosmetics, allowing historians to reconstruct surprisingly intimate details of everyday life. What makes these discoveries so extraordinary is that they often challenge our assumptions about the ancient world. We tend to imagine history as distant and anonymous, populated by names and textbooks rather than real people. Yet standing before one of these carefully preserved mummies quickly changes that perspective. The wrinkles around the eyes, the shape of the hands, the carefully braided hair, and the slight curve of a smile remind us that these were individuals with families, ambitions, fears, friendships, and ordinary routines. They laughed, worried about their children, celebrated festivals, mourned loved ones, and hoped for a peaceful future, just as people do today. The embalmers who wrapped these bodies never imagined CT scanners, DNA sequencing, or climate control museums. They believed they were preparing someone to meet the gods. Instead, they also prepared them to meet future generations. Every successful mummy became an unexpected messenger, carrying knowledge safely across thousands of years until modern archaeologists finally reopened the tombs. And yet, remarkable as human mummies are, they tell only part of the story. For in ancient Egypt, the desire to preserve life forever was not limited to kings, queens, priests, or ordinary citizens. Cats were mummified. Dogs were mummified. Falcons, crocodiles, monkeys, snakes, bulls, fish, and even tiny insects sometimes received the same astonishing treatment. To modern minds, this seems almost unbelievable. But for the ancient Egyptians, it made perfect sense. If someone living in ancient Egypt could visit one of today's museums, there are many things that would surely surprise them. Electric lights, glass display cases, cameras, and visitors from every corner of the world would all seem extraordinary. Yet perhaps the greatest surprise would be discovering that modern people are often fascinated not only by human mummies, but by the animals as well. To many visitors, the sight of a carefully wrapped cat, a tiny crocodile preserved inside linen, or even a mummified fish can seem almost amusing at first. Why would anyone go to such incredible effort for an animal? Were these simply beloved pets? Religious offerings? Symbols? The answer, as is so often the case in Egyptian history, is wonderfully complex. Ancient Egyptians shared their world with animals in a way that feels both familiar and deeply different from our own experience. Some animals were companions who slept beside their owners, much like modern pets. Others worked alongside humans in fields and villages. Some represented powerful gods, while others were admired for qualities such as strength intelligence, courage, or grace. The natural world was woven into Egyptian religion so completely that animals often became living symbols of divine power. Preserving them after death, therefore, seemed every bit as reasonable as preserving a human being. Perhaps no animal is more closely associated with ancient Egypt than the cat. Today, cats rule countless homes across the world, charming their owners with equal measures of affection and independence. Surprisingly, that relationship has very ancient roots. Egyptian cats were admired not simply because they were graceful creatures, but because they serve an important practical purpose. Granaries filled with precious grain attracted rats and mice capable of destroying entire harvests. Cats hunted these pests with remarkable efficiency, protecting the food supply that sustained entire communities. Over time, their usefulness gradually blended with religion, and cats became closely connected with the goddess Batet. Batet was one of Egypt's most beloved deities, usually depicted either as a graceful domestic cat or as a woman with the head of a cat. She represented protection, motherhood, fertility, music, joy, and the warmth of the home. Her temples attracted pilgrims from across Egypt, many of whom left offerings in her honor. Archaeologists have uncovered enormous cat cemeteries containing hundreds of thousands of mummified cats. Some were undoubtedly cherished household companions, carefully buried by grieving families. Others appear to have been raised specifically as sacred offerings to Batet, purchased by worshippers visiting her temples. While this practice may seem unusual today, it reflected a deeply held belief that presenting a sacred animal to a deity strengthened one's prayers. Some of these feline mummies are astonishingly beautiful. Tiny linen bandages were wrapped with incredible precision, often creating elegant geometric patterns across the animal's body. Painted masks with delicate cat ears and carefully drawn eyes sometimes covered the face, transforming even a small household pet into an object of remarkable artistry. Looking at them today, one cannot help but notice the affection invested in their creation. Dogs occupied a different but equally important place within Egyptian society. Faithful hunting companions, loyal guardians, and trusted family animals frequently accompanied people throughout their lives. In religion, dogs and jackals became closely associated with Anubis, the great protector of cemeteries and embalming. Because wild jackals were often seen wandering near desert burial grounds, Egyptians naturally connected these mysterious animals with the world of the dead. Mummified dogs have been discovered in astonishing numbers, particularly near temples dedicated to Anubis. One underground complex at Saqqara contained the remains of millions of dog mummies, revealing just how widespread this tradition eventually became. Then there were the crocodiles. To modern visitors, the thought of preserving a crocodile may sound rather intimidating. Even today, the Nile crocodile remains one of Africa's most formidable predators. Reaching lengths of over 5 meters and capable of incredible power, these ancient reptiles inspired both fear and admiration among the Egyptians. Rather than viewing crocodiles simply as dangerous animals, they associated them with the god Sobuk, a powerful deity connected with the Nile, military strength, fertility, and royal authority. In regions where Sobuk was especially revered, sacred crocodiles lived within temple pools, cared for by priests and adorned with jewelry or decorative ornaments. When these revered animals died, they received careful mummification just like important members of society. Some crocodile mummies are truly astonishing in scale. Museums display examples stretching several meters in length, their powerful jaws still clearly visible beneath carefully arranged linen wrappings. In certain cases, archaeologists have even discovered smaller baby crocodiles placed inside the larger mummy, perhaps symbolizing fertility or family. It is a remarkable reminder that Egyptian embalmers applied their extraordinary skills not only to humans, but to creatures of every imaginable size. Birds, too, held profound religious significance. Falcons represented the sky god Horus, whose sharp eyesight and majestic flight made him an ideal symbol of kingship and divine protection. Ibises became sacred to Thoth, the god of wisdom, writing, mathematics, and knowledge. Across Egypt, millions of mummified birds have been uncovered, carefully wrapped, and offered at temples dedicated to these deities. Some are so small that they fit comfortably in the palm of a hand, yet they receive the same respectful attention to detail as far larger mummies. Perhaps most surprising of all is the sheer variety of animals that entered the embalming workshops. Archaeologists have identified mummified monkeys, gazelles, snakes, bulls, fish, hawks, shrews, beetles, and even tiny mice. Sacred bulls, particularly those known as the Apis bulls, enjoyed an especially privileged status. Considered earthly manifestations of divine power, these magnificent animals lived in luxurious surroundings and received elaborate funerals upon their deaths. Their enormous stone sarcophagi, some weighing more than 60 tons, still rest within the underground galleries of the Serapeum at Saqqara, astonishing visitors with their immense scale. Modern scientific research has revealed fascinating details about these animal mummies. CT scans allow researchers to examine their contents without disturbing the wrappings. In many cases, complete skeletons remain beautifully preserved inside. In others, however, scientists have discovered surprising shortcuts. Some animal mummies contain only a few bones, feathers, or fragments of tissue rather than an entire animal. A handful appear to contain nothing at all beyond reeds or linen. Historians believe this may reflect periods when demand for sacred offerings became so great that temple workshops struggled to keep up. Even in the ancient world, popularity sometimes exceeded supply. The careful study of animal mummies has also transformed our understanding of Egyptian trade, religion, and everyday life. Chemical analyses of resins reveal where embalming materials originated. DNA studies identify breeding practices for sacred animals. Isotopic testing helps determine what they ate and where they lived. In many ways, these creatures continue teaching us about the civilization that preserved them long after both humans and animals disappeared from the Nile Valley. There is something quietly touching about all of this. Ancient Egyptians did not separate themselves sharply from the natural world. They saw animals as companions, protectors, workers, symbols of the gods, and participants in the great cycle of life and death. To preserve a beloved cat, a sacred falcon, or a mighty crocodile was not strange to them. It was another expression of a belief that life, in all its forms, possessed meaning beyond death. And yet, despite the remarkable success of mummification, one curious question still lingers in many people's minds. If these bodies have survived for more than 3,000 years, what do they actually smell like? The answer turns out to be far more pleasant and far more surprising than most people expect. It is one of the questions that almost every museum guide, archaeologist, or Egyptologist has been asked at some point. What do mummies smell like? It is an understandable question. After all, when we hear the word mummy, our minds often imagine something unpleasant. Popular films have taught us to expect dusty tombs filled with rotting bodies, stale air, and the unmistakable smell of decay. Horror stories have only strengthened that image, portraying mummies as frightening relics emerging from forgotten graves after thousands of years. Yet the real answer is both unexpected and strangely comforting. Many ancient Egyptian mummies do not smell bad at all. In fact, several scientists who have studied them closely describe their scent using words like woody, earthy, sweet, spicy, and even pleasant. The reason lies in the extraordinary care the embalmers invested in preserving every body. By the time a mummy was finally sealed inside its coffin, almost everything responsible for ordinary decomposition had already been removed or neutralized. The internal organs most likely to decay had been carefully extracted. Moisture had been drawn out over weeks using natron. The body had been treated with oils, coated with fragrant resins, wrapped in clean linen, and protected inside layers of coffins before finally resting within a sealed tomb where the dry Egyptian climate slowed the passage of time even further. Decay, which normally happens within weeks or months, had been interrupted almost completely. Instead of the smell of decomposition, what often remained were the very materials used during embalming. Modern chemical analysis has revealed traces of cedar oil, pine resin, beeswax, pistachio resin, juniper, myrrh, frankincense, and other aromatic substances still lingering within mummy wrappings after more than 3,000 years. Some of these ingredients were incredibly expensive imports, transported over vast distances through deserts and across seas before finally reaching Egypt. The embalmers did not choose them simply because they smelled pleasant. Many possessed natural antibacterial and antifungal properties that help preserve the body while also surrounding it with fragrances considered worthy of the gods. Imagine entering an embalming workshop during the height of Egypt's New Kingdom. Rather than an overwhelming odor of death, you would likely notice warm scents rising gently from heated resins. Sweet smoke from burning incense would drift through the room. Fresh linen lay neatly folded beside polished bronze tools. Bowls filled with fragrant oils reflected the flickering light of oil lamps, while priests quietly recited prayers in voices barely louder than whispers. It would probably have smelled more like an ancient temple than anything resembling a modern horror film. One particularly valuable ingredient was cedar oil, imported from the forests of what is now Lebanon. Egyptian craftsmen prized cedar because it resisted insects and decay, while its rich woody aroma lingered for years. Combined with sticky tree resins, the oil created protective coatings that sealed the wrappings against moisture and helped preserve the body's delicate tissues. Modern laboratory studies continue to identify traces of these compounds inside royal mummies, confirming just how sophisticated Egyptian embalming had become. Then there was myrrh, still used today in perfumes and certain traditional medicines. Myrrh produces a warm, slightly smoky fragrance with hints of spice and sweetness. To the Egyptians, it carried both practical and religious significance. It appeared in temple rituals, sacred ceremonies, perfumes, cosmetics, and funerary preparations alike. Frankincense, another treasured resin, released a light citrus-like aroma when burned and became closely associated with worship throughout much of the ancient Near East. Together, these precious substances transformed the embalming process into something that appealed not only to sight and touch, but also to smell. Recent scientific research has explored this mystery in fascinating detail. Rather than relying only on human observation, researchers have used sophisticated instruments capable of analyzing tiny airborne molecules released by ancient mummies. These devices can identify individual chemical compounds without damaging the fragile remains themselves. In several studies, scientists found that the dominant scent originated not from the bodies, but from the embalming materials that continued releasing faint aromatic molecules after thousands of years. It is a remarkable testament to the quality of Egyptian preservation that these fragrances have survived almost as successfully as the mummies themselves. Of course, not every mummy has remained perfectly preserved. Time affects everything eventually. Tomb robberies exposed some bodies to moisture. Flooding occasionally reached burial chambers. Changes in temperature and humidity over centuries damaged others, while certain mummies suffered from less careful preservation than royal examples. In those cases, unpleasant odors can certainly develop. Yet among well-preserved mummies housed under modern museum conditions, visitors are often surprised to learn that there is very little smell at all. Museum conservators take extraordinary precautions to protect these ancient remains. Temperature, humidity, and air quality are carefully controlled to slow further deterioration. Handling is kept to an absolute minimum, and scientists often wear protective gloves and masks. Not because the mummies are dangerous, but because modern oils, bacteria, and even ordinary breathing can gradually affect these priceless archaeological treasures. Ironically, after surviving deserts, tomb robbers, and 3,000 years of history, one of the greatest threats to a mummy today is simply too much human contact. There's something quietly poetic about all of this. The embalmers hoped that their careful work would preserve not only the appearance of the deceased, but also their dignity. They filled the workshop with beautiful scents because they believed the journey into eternity deserved beauty rather than decay. Thousands of years later, modern science has revealed that, in many cases, they achieved exactly what they intended. The gentle aromas that occasionally escape from ancient wrappings are not reminders of death. They are faint echoes of cedar forests, desert resins, temple incense, and the patient hands of craftsmen who believed they were preparing someone to live forever. And yet, despite all their remarkable skill, there was one danger the embalmers could never fully protect against. It was not disease. It was not decay. It was other people. For hidden beyond the sealed stone doors of countless tombs were treasures of unimaginable value. And wherever treasure exists, someone will eventually try to steal it. The next chapter of our story belongs not to priests or embalmers, but to the grave robbers who risked everything for the riches buried beneath the sands of Egypt. The ancient Egyptians did everything they possibly could to protect their dead. They hid tombs deep beneath mountains. They sealed entrances with enormous stone blocks weighing several tons. They carved false passageways designed to confuse intruders. They placed warning inscriptions on walls, asking the gods to punish anyone who disturbed the resting place of the deceased. Some tombs were so cleverly concealed that even members of the royal court may not have known their exact locations once the funeral was complete. And yet, almost from the very beginning, tomb robbers were already at work. This surprises many people, because we often imagine grave robbery as something that happened centuries later, perhaps during Roman times or the age of European explorers. The reality was far more immediate. Archaeological evidence shows that many tombs were broken into only years, or sometimes even months, after they had been sealed. Gold has always tempted people, and ancient Egypt was filled with it. A royal burial represented unimaginable wealth. Imagine standing before a newly completed tomb around 1300 BC. Inside rested furniture covered in gold leaf. Chests overflowed with jewelry. Rings decorated with precious stones glittered beneath the light of oil lamps. Fine linen, perfumes, silver vessels, ceremonial weapons, carved statues, and beautiful amulets surrounded the mummy. Even the coffin itself might contain hundreds of kilograms of gold. For someone willing to risk everything, it was the greatest treasure vault in the ancient world. Of course, robbing a tomb was one of the most serious crimes imaginable. It was not simply theft. It was sacrilege. The Egyptians believed disturbing a burial endangered the deceased's eternal existence. Stealing funerary goods meant taking objects meant to sustain someone forever. Damaging the mummy itself was even worse, because the body formed the physical home of the soul. A robber was not merely stealing possessions. They were interfering with eternity. Punishments reflected the seriousness of the crime. Ancient court records describe severe penalties including beatings, forced labor, mutilation, and in especially serious cases, execution. During the New Kingdom, official investigations into tomb robberies became surprisingly detailed. One famous collection of documents, known today as the Abbot Papyrus, records government officials inspecting royal tombs after reports of widespread looting. Reading these ancient reports feels strangely familiar. Investigators measured broken seals, questioned suspects, examined damaged burial chambers, and carefully documented missing treasures almost exactly as modern detectives investigate crimes today. Some confessions survive as well. Under questioning, captured robbers admitted entering tombs by night, breaking through stone walls, stripping mummies of jewelry, and melting down stolen gold almost immediately so that it could not easily be identified. Their descriptions paint vivid pictures of desperate men crawling through narrow passages with flickering oil lamps, knowing the discovery almost certainly meant death. Yet despite these dangers, tomb robbery became so widespread that even the pharaohs themselves were not safe. One by one, many royal tombs were opened. Gold masks disappeared. Jewelry vanished. Beautiful furniture was smashed apart to remove precious metals. In many cases, robbers even tore apart the mummy's linen wrappings, searching for hidden rings, or amulets tucked between the layers. To modern archaeologists, these damaged mummies tell heartbreaking stories. Fingers are sometimes missing because rings prove difficult to remove. Necklaces have vanished, leaving only impressions where they once rested. Linen that embalmers wrapped so carefully has been ripped apart by hurried thieves searching for treasure. It seems almost impossible to imagine. The same kings who commanded vast armies and built monuments visible for miles could do nothing to stop a handful of determined robbers after death. Eventually, Egypt's priests realized something extraordinary had to be done. Around the 11th century BC, during a period of political instability, officials secretly reopened many royal tombs, not to rob them, but to rescue them. Working quietly, they gathered the bodies of Egypt's greatest rulers from damaged burial places across the Valley of the Kings. One by one, they carefully rewrapped damaged mummies, repaired broken coffins whenever possible, and carried them to hidden locations known only to a small circle of trusted priests. Their goal was simple. If the original tombs could no longer protect the kings, then the kings themselves would have to disappear. One of the most remarkable hiding places was discovered only in 1881 near Deir el-Bahari. Inside a narrow shaft, archaeologists uncovered what is now known as the royal cache. It was one of the greatest surprises in Egyptology. Instead of finding a single ruler, they discovered dozens. Ramesses II, Seti I, Thutmose III, Amenhotep I, Second Retau, and many more rested together in unexpected silence, placed side by priests over 3,000 years ago in a desperate attempt to save them from thieves. Ironically, those priests succeeded. Had they not hidden the royal mummies, many would almost certainly have been destroyed forever. Another fascinating discovery occurred in the tomb of Amenhotep II, where several additional royal mummies had been concealed inside another secret cache. These hidden collections completely transformed historians' understanding of ancient Egypt. Rather than existing in isolated tombs, many of history's greatest pharaohs had spent their final centuries sharing secret underground shelters, protected by priests whose names are now almost forgotten. Even today, archaeologists continue finding evidence that ancient Egyptians repeatedly reopened tombs, not always to steal from them, but to repair damage, conduct religious ceremonies, or move vulnerable burials to safer locations. The story of Egyptian mummies is therefore not simply one of burial followed by discovery. It is a much more complicated history involving rescue missions, secret relocations, careful restoration, and centuries of determined efforts to preserve the past. Then came the 19th century. European explorers, scholars, collectors, and adventurers began arriving in Egypt in growing numbers. Their curiosity led to many extraordinary archaeological discoveries, but also sparked an enormous trade in antiquities. Unfortunately, not everyone who entered a tomb was interested in careful scientific study. Some mummies were bought and sold like curiosities. Others were unwrapped at lavish social gatherings where wealthy guests watched ancient linen being peeled away simply for entertainment. Looking back today, these events seem almost unbelievable, yet they were surprisingly fashionable during parts of the Victorian era. Thankfully, archaeology has changed enormously since then. Modern Egyptologists treat every mummy as an irreplaceable human being rather than an object of curiosity. Instead of cutting away wrappings, researchers use CT scanners, digital imaging, DNA analysis, and microscopic chemical testing to learn about ancient lives while leaving the mummy almost entirely untouched. Museums across the world now emphasize preservation, respect, and education rather than spectacle. It is one of history's quiet ironies. The embalmers hoped to preserve bodies so they could live forever in the afterlife. Instead, they preserved them so successfully that thousands of years later, they continue teaching millions of people about one of humanity's greatest civilizations. Kings who feared being forgotten are still remembered. Children buried with tiny toys still make us smile. Cats wrapped in careful linen still inspire affection. and anonymous embalmers, whose names have long disappeared beneath the sands, continue to astonish modern scientists with techniques that were centuries ahead of their time. Perhaps that is the greatest triumph of mummification. Not that it defeated death, but that it defeated time itself. As our journey through ancient Egypt slowly comes to an end, it is worth pausing to consider one final question. Why they go to all this effort? 70 days of careful preparation, hundreds of meters of linen, rare oils brought from distant kingdoms, beautifully carved coffins, magnificent tombs, countless prayers, an entire profession devoted to preserving the human body. Surely, all of that required an enormous amount of time, skill, money, and dedication. The simplest answer is that the Egyptians believed in life after death. But that explanation, while true, barely scratches the surface. The deeper truth is that mummification reveals how ancient Egyptians understood life itself. For them, death was never the opposite of life. It was simply another chapter. Modern societies often think of history in terms of great battles, famous kings, or enormous monuments. Ancient Egypt certainly had all of those. It built pyramids that still dominate the horizon after 4,500 years. Its pharaohs ruled vast kingdoms. Its temples remain among the greatest architectural achievements ever created. Yet if we truly want to understand the Egyptians, perhaps the pyramids are not the best place to begin. Perhaps we should begin with something much quieter. A single family saying goodbye to someone they loved. Because beneath all the gold, the hieroglyphs, and the remarkable rituals, mummification was ultimately an act of hope. Parents hoped they would meet their children again. Husbands hoped they would once again walk beside their wives. Friends believed separation was only temporary. Even kings, despite all their wealth and power, desired exactly what ordinary farmers desired. Another sunrise, another chance to live, another opportunity to exist with the people they loved. In many ways, that hope feels surprisingly familiar. Human beings have always searched for meaning beyond their own lifetime. Some people write books, some build cities, others plant trees whose shade they will never sit beneath. Some raise children, others create music, paintings, inventions, or stories that survive them. The ancient Egyptians chose preservation. Instead of leaving memories behind, they tried to preserve the person themselves. And remarkably, they succeeded. Today, more than 3,000 years later, scientists can examine fingerprints preserved in linen. Hair still rests upon ancient heads. Tiny eyelashes remain attached. The wrinkles of old age can still be seen upon the faces of kings. Medical researchers diagnose arthritis, broken bones, dental disease, and even genetic conditions using bodies that should have disappeared into dust before the Roman Empire even existed. Few civilizations have introduced themselves to the future as clearly as ancient Egypt has. Perhaps the most beautiful part of this story is that modern archaeology no longer sees these mummies merely as museum objects. Instead, researchers increasingly treat them as individuals. A young mother, an elderly craftsman, a temple singer, a royal child, a priest who spent decades serving in quiet temples, a soldier who survived battles along the Nile, a little girl whose favorite necklace still rests beside her after thousands of years. Every mummy reminds us that history is not made only by famous names. History is made by ordinary people, people who worried about tomorrow, people who laughed with friends, people who worked long days beneath the Egyptian sun, people who loved their families, people who hoped they would be remembered. And in many cases, they were. Even the embalmers deserve a final moment of appreciation. We rarely know their names. No enormous statues celebrate them. No great temples were built in their honor. Yet they mastered one of the most remarkable preservation techniques humanity has ever developed. Without microscopes, without chemistry laboratories, without modern medicine, using little more than careful observation, experience, patience, and an extraordinary respect for the dead. Their work has lasted longer than almost any building, government, or empire ever created. That is an astonishing legacy. And perhaps there is one final irony. The Egyptians believed they were preserving bodies so souls could recognize them in eternity. Instead, they also preserved an entire civilization for us. Because of their care, we know how they dressed, what they ate, which diseases they suffered, what perfumes they wore, how their children played, which animals they loved, how they buried their kings, and even, as we discovered earlier, what their mummies still smell like. Across more than 5,000 years, they continue telling their story without speaking a single word. The desert protected them. The linen embraced them. Time passed over them like the slow movement of the Nile itself. And still they remain. So tonight, as you settle comfortably beneath your own blankets, perhaps spare a quiet thought for those ancient embalmers working beneath the warm Egyptian sky. For the patient craftsmen carefully folding linen around gentle hands. For priests softly whispering prayers that echoed through candlelit workshops. For families leaving flowers beside sealed tombs. For cats curled peacefully beside their owners. For kings whose faces would sleep through millennia. And for a civilization that believed with complete sincerity that love, memory, and hope could survive long after life itself had ended. Perhaps, in their own remarkable way, they were right. Because thousands of years later, here we are, still listening, still learning, still remembering. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the entire story of mummification, and subscribe to Blanket Histories if you enjoyed this peaceful exploration of history. There are many more fascinating stories waiting to discover together. Stories of forgotten kingdoms, strange medieval jobs, mysterious ancient traditions, and the quiet lives of ordinary people who shaped our world. For now, though, the Nile has grown quiet. The temple lamps have burned low. The desert wind has settled over the ancient sands. And somewhere beneath the stars of Egypt, history sleeps. Good night.